round of questions. The 6-minute round starting with the Conservative Party and Mr. Barrett.
Minister Haidu, a former auditor for the Indigenous procurement program has stated that your Liberal government was warned about specific cases of alleged fraud. He said the government hamstrung auditors and repeatedly ignored warnings that the program was being abused by non-Indigenous companies. Why did you ignore the auditor's warnings?
Well, first of all, I was deeply concerned to hear of this weekend. It was the first I heard of this allegation, and it took immediate action with the department, and I am calling for a full external audit of the program.
A full external audit. In the case that's been outlined in the remarks of the former auditor, we see that having the government check its own work is not actually oversight. Are you able to tell us at whose direction Indigenous Services Canada determined that the department would take on full responsibility for confirming the eligibility of Indigenous businesses for the program after 2021?
Well, what I can say is, first of all, I just want to thank you for the question, and it's clear by your question that we agree that a 5% procurement target is important and that we need to ensure that any program like this has integrity. So I appreciate the question. And I agree with you that if we don't have integrity of this program, that we're not actually going to be able to satisfy not just Canadians, but Indigenous people that a program like this is actually working to their goals. What I can say is that the company that was contracted by Indigenous Services Canada to do this work has made these allegations. They're very serious. As I said, I'm extremely concerned. I found out about these concerns this weekend and took immediate action to call for an external audit. The department is working now on what that will look like and will come back to me with a plan.
Minister, is it your belief today that the program has integrity?
It is my belief that there are many aspects of the program that are delivering for Indigenous companies. But look, even some misuse of the program puts the program at risk. And so for me, an allegation like that auditor has made is very serious. And I think we should all take it seriously and we should act on it.
Minister Duclos, were you aware of Randy Boissonnault's claims of Indigenous heritage that were echoed and promoted by the Liberal Party of Canada, both on their social media and in fundraising efforts? Were you aware that he had made those claims?
Comme vous, je suis l'actualité.
Like you, I read the news, I listen to my colleagues' remarks, and like you, or maybe less than you, because last week we heard MP Randy Boissonnault speak about that issue.
Raised off of what was a false claim. It was a lie that had been put forward. Now, if the lie was not Mr. Boissonnault, and Mr. Boissonnault claims it wasn't him who told the lie, in which case that would rest with the Liberal Party. They fundraised off it, and we've seen multiple instances now where they're trying to, the Liberal Party is trying to cover this up. Media has continued to report more and more revelations that what Mr. Boissonnault says and what is true are often very different things. Do you think that Canadians should be concerned that the Liberal Party of Canada fundraised off of what we now know to be a lie, where Mr. Boissonnault had claimed to have Indigenous heritage, and that he used that same, his company used that same false claim in an attempt to disenfranchise Indigenous-owned businesses and win contracts under that false pretense?
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Carr, point of order.
Yeah, just perhaps the record can show, I think we established quite clearly last meeting when Mr. Boissonnault was present that he did not claim
That's
Indigenous
not a point of order.
heritage, nor did he at any point. So perhaps my colleagues across the way, when making such insinuations, can be mindful of what the facts show.
Well, on that point of order, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. Point of order, Mr. Barrett.
Yeah, as you well know, Mr. Carr's intervention is not a point of order. It does not reference any standing order. It's simply debate in an attempt to interrupt the proceedings. I was very respectful in my exchange and offering time to the ministers. What I'd ask is that Liberal members be as respectful, even if they're trying to cover for what is shameful behaviour by the Liberal member for Edmonton, Randy Boissonnault, and his lies and false claims.
Same point of order.
So thank you, Mr. Barrett. We're quickly getting into debate here, but Mr. Carr, do you have a point of order? That
Just very quickly on the same point of order, Mr. Barrett, I believe, began referencing shameful behavior and other allegations, which I don't think are actually points of order. Just for reference, thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. Let's get back to asking the questions that we're all here to hear the testimony of the ministers. I'm going to turn the floor back over to Mr. Barrett. You have a little bit more than 2 minutes left. I'd stop the clock, and so I'll hand the floor back to you, Mr. Barrett.
Before your Liberal colleague attempted to interfere to cover up for the shameful behavior and lies of Liberal MP Randy Boissonnault with respect to his claims to Indigenous heritage and attempting to defraud Indigenous-owned businesses of their ability to get government contracts, and the Liberal Party of Canada promoting that lie in an attempt to raise funds off that false claim. Minister, do you think that behavior is appropriate and that Canadians should be concerned with the Liberal Party's actions in this case?
I'm not the chair of this committee, so I cannot determine whether MP Carr's intervention was a point of order. But what I know is that what he said was correct. No? The making false allegations, making all sorts of falsehoods sound true because they're all compiled together is not a fair treatment of the facts, and I would suggest again that you get back to what the MP Boissonnault said to you just last week, and you ask him those questions if you think they are relevant.
So what we know
important.
to be true, Minister, is that every time that Mr. Boissonnault came before a standing committee, that what he said was later proven to be not true, that he has demonstrated himself to be someone who is not truthful or honest. So we can't refer to Mr. Boissonnault's testimony as what is honest or right. What we know, the facts are, that the Liberal Party of Canada promoted what was a false claim about Randy Boissonnault's Indigenous heritage. This was my question to you. Your party, sir, the Liberal Party fundraised off of what we know to be not true. And Canadians are, of course, concerned about this. This type of dishonesty borders on corruption when Canadians don't know what the government has said, whether or not it's true or it's not true. Should Canadians be concerned with the actions of your party when we know that one of your former cabinet colleagues showed a pattern for dishonesty and lies, up to and including...
Point of order, Mr. Chair. I believe Mr. Barrett is an experienced...
Point of order, Mr. Carr.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. Barrett's an experienced parliamentarian. He knows that he can't refer to a member's behavior as lying. In fact, my Conservative colleagues across the way did this on multiple occasions last meeting, and in fact, it was a Conservative chair that correctly ruled at that moment in time that that was unparliamentary language. He should apologize and withdraw that comment. Thank you.
That's not what I said.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. We are getting just to the end of the time. Mr. Barrett had asked a question. I'm going to give the minister an opportunity.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Carr?
Yeah. When a member is referred to by another member as a liar, whether that's in the chamber or at committee, it requires a withdrawal and an apology. So I think that as chair, you should be giving an indication of what you expect in terms of the way that members comport themselves around the table. I appreciate that we want to get to a further line of questioning, but when one member calls another a liar, not only does that in and of itself delay the proceedings, forcing someone like myself to raise a point of order, but further to that, it does require the chair to give an indication that there should be an apology and a withdrawal, at the very least a withdrawal of the commentary. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. And I do want to remind members to ensure that you are using parliamentary language at all time. You'll know that in Standing Order 18, you're not to use disrespectful or offensive language. And I just want to remind members of this. We don't want to get into this kind of behavior in this committee. We want to be able to get the testimony that we're all seeking to do here and that the House indeed ordered us to do. So I would just want to remind members to do that and just to not use disrespectful or offensive language in this committee. We are at the end of this time, but I want to give Minister Duclos an opportunity to respond.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vais juste répéter.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to repeat in French what I said in English a few minutes. Amalgamating various things that might seem true at a very high level, but that are collectively wrong is not a good way of proceeding. I would propose that the MP continues his discussion with the MP in question.
To our
The Globe and Mail has a shocking story today about abuse of the Indigenous procurement program by the Canadian Healthcare Agency. According to a whistleblower, the government was putting in place tight constraints on the work of auditors as soon as they started to identify serious problems. The government was warned by auditors, and their response to those warnings was to make life more difficult for the auditors. Minister, you told my colleague Michael Barrett that you only heard about allegations against Canadian Healthcare Agency this weekend. Is that correct?
No, I did not. I told your colleague that I was made aware of the auditor's concerns overall about the program this weekend, and that it was deeply distressing to me, and that I.
But you were previously aware of his allegations against Canadian Healthcare Agency?
What I'm saying is that that was the first I heard of Mr. Hartle's allegations.
When did you first become aware of concerns about the indigeneity of this partnership involving the Canadian Healthcare Agency? When did you first become aware of that?
The department routinely reviews, as you've heard before.
When did you first become aware? It's not about the department. When did you first become aware?
As I said, this weekend, I too heard about what was in the Globe and Mail, and I was.
But when did you
concerned.
first become aware of concerns about the Canadian Healthcare Agency?
I think you've asked questions about this company before, have you not?
So when did you first become aware of it, though?
So the first time I became aware of it was, I don't have an exact date, but a few months ago.
A few months ago. Minister, you said in response to my questions that, quote, I would say that it was an abuse of being on the list without adequate representation. You said this about Canadian Healthcare Agency back at the end of October, and you've tried to represent the facts in a very different way to my colleague, Mr. Barrett, which is disappointing to say the least. The AFN has said that.
I could respond to that because that is actually putting words in my mouth, and that is not what I said.
Can I have the time, Mr. Chair? I've got another question.
So, Mr. Genius, you do have the time, and the minister will have an opportunity to respond to that.
Okay, I have 3 minutes left. The AFN says that you're not hitting your 5% target. It's closer to 1%. That's what Chief Joanna Bernard told the Government Operations Committee. Is the AFN correct?
Not according to our records, but what I can say is that I understand the concern, and I'm actually, as I said to your colleague, glad that the Conservative Party is fighting so hard to protect this 5% procurement target. This is good news. It means that we all want this program to work better, including the AFN.
You're not answering my question, and you were somewhat inaccurate in your response with Mr. Barrett. So you don't agree with the AFN, I understand.
I would say that our data is different than the AFN's, and that, in fact, in some departments we are exceeding the procurement target of 5%.
You're either hitting it or you're not. It's not as if the AFN is experiencing things differently, right? You're either hitting the 1% or you're hitting a 5%.
Well, what I would say is that our data demonstrates that we are actually hitting our procurement target amongst
your data
a number
also
of
shows,
departments.
Madam Minister, that you're dramatically purging the Indigenous business list. That since 2022, you've taken over 1,000 companies off that list. You've taken over 100 companies off this year alone. And I'm trying to square the fact that, on the one hand, not a single person or company has been penalized for Indigenous identity fraud, but on the other hand, you're dramatically purging the list, which suggests that there's some people on that list that shouldn't be on that list. How do you square the fact that Indigenous leaders across the board are saying that abuse of this program is rampant? You're taking many companies off the list, and yet nobody's been held accountable for Indigenous identity fraud.
Well, actually, what I would say is that Indigenous peoples are saying that economic reconciliation and the work of the Government of Canada in terms of its procurement target is actually changing realities for Indigenous businesses across the country. But
Sorry, Minister, could you just answer the question? Is it acceptable that nobody's been held accountable for Indigenous identity fraud by your government?
What I would say is it's great that you care about this program
could you answer
to the degree
question?
that you do. Because what we all agree,
is it acceptable to you
about,
that nobody has been
Mr.
held
Chair,
accountable?
point of order.
I can't answer the question, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Carr.
Just a problem we've run into previously, but very difficult for us to have translation services provided adequately when there's talking back and forth. So perhaps we could just resettle things. Thank you.
Yeah, just on the same point of order, I agree with Mr. Carr. I'm trying to ask questions, and the minister is not answering them. and I think should be brought to order. I've got 30 seconds left, and I'd just like to know whether she thinks it's acceptable.
Garnett, before doing that, I just want to remind members here not to talk over the witnesses. We want to make sure we're avoiding the crosstalk. It makes it very difficult for the interpreters to do their work, and for members that have challenges hearing as well. So just want to remind members to do that.
Et, Monsieur le Président, c'était les deux voix que j'ai entendues. Alors.
So I heard many voices.
30 seconds, I'll try one more time, Minister. Nobody has been held accountable by your government for Indigenous identity fraud. Meanwhile, you've taken Canadian Healthcare Agency off the list, and you can't tell me why. You've taken Dalian Enterprises off the list, and you can't tell me why. You've taken over 1,000 companies off the list, yet nobody's been held accountable for it. Is it acceptable to you that not a single company has ever been held accountable for Indigenous identity fraud by your government?
It appears to me that I have answered your question, and I have answered your question repeatedly. But I will tell you that removals from the list are for many reasons that can be quite benign. For example, businesses could be closed. They could be non-responsive to requests from the department.
1,000 businesses are suddenly non-responsive?
Changes in the business ownership structure. There could be a number of different reasons.
Okay.
And
Could you provide a breakdown of those reasons for each of those companies?
Appel au règlement.
Appel au règlement, Monsieur Carr.
Point of order. Yes, again, it's very, very difficult to hear in both official languages. We do have Francophone members and other people listening in both languages. So, Chair, I hope that our colleagues can try to apply the rules in a better way. Thank you. Mr. Carr, the time has run out for Mr. Genuis.
Opportunity to finish her answer, and then we'll move on to the next questioner.
It's affirming that the Conservative Party agrees that the 5% target is so important that we must ensure that the way that we do this affirms Indigenous identity. But it is also clear that the Conservative Party has no idea what to do about this problem. We do, and we're going to take control.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Mr. Zimmer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to our witnesses for coming today. A recent article said, Canadian Army says new military sleeping bags are not suitable for typical Canadian winter. And Rob Hubert, an Arctic expert, said, I wonder if they should have just gone to Canadian Tire. The Defense Department spent more than $34.8 million on 55,000 sleeping bags. From the article, troops who had used the recently issued general purpose sleeping bag system late last fall in a preparatory exercise found several critical issues. Temperatures during the deployment ranged from -5 degrees Celsius during the day to -20 degrees Celsius at night, hardly harsh conditions in the Canadian winter or north. The critical issues discovered by the soldiers related to a lack of warmth from the new GP
Point of order, Mr.
SBS.
Chair.
I'm pausing the time here. Point of order, Mr. Carr.
Although I deeply respect that my colleague is asking important questions that pertain to the men and women in our armed forces, last time I checked, this is not the Committee for National Defense, nor is there anything in the motion related to relevance on this topic. Perhaps our colleague can be reminded, Mr. Chair, of why we're here. He should know that because the 18 hours that we're sitting was forced upon us by them. So perhaps he can get back to the topic at hand. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. We do provide a fairly wide range of latitude here, but I do want to remind members to make sure they're sticking with the matter at hand here as well. I did stop the time for Mr. Zimmer. You have a little bit more than 4 minutes.
The critical issues discovered by the soldiers related to a lack of warmth with the new GPSBS, said the briefing note written on December 5th, 2023. Why would you buy 55,000 sleeping bags for $34.8 million that don't work in our Canadian North or the Arctic?
Je pense que la réponse a déjà été suggérée par...
I think the answer was already suggested by my colleague, MP Ben Carr. You have the right to ask a question. You also have the right to have the right person to answer, and that would be Minister Blair.
Minister, but actually it's your department that's in charge of procurement and procurement of military-issued materials. I have in my order paper question that we asked for this September. It was given to your department. You answered us. That tells me that was your department that was responsible.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Mr.
Point
Chair,
of order for Mr. Carr.
I'm seeking your guidance. I understand, as a chair as well, that we can give a generous amount of latitude. Can Mr. Zimmer, and if not you, please provide some explanation as to how anything in the order that the House passed here in relation to the question that he is currently asking in relation to the procurement of military supplies is connected. If not, Mr. Chair, then I will yet again intervene with a point of order to ask for further guidance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Carr, and certainly the study that we're doing today is an update to the barriers to economic development in Indigenous communities. I was giving a fairly wide latitude to Mr. Zimmer in hopes that his line of questioning would circulate to the matter at hand. And so I do just want to remind members to stick to the topic at hand, and that indeed that we have been ordered by the House to do this study on. So with that, I'll turn the floor back to Mr. Zimmer. You have a little bit more than 3 minutes left.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll get back to my question. Again, the question went to your ministry minister about, and you sent back as an answer, you said this adaptability makes the sleeping bag suitable for diverse operational environments, including but not limited to Arctic conditions. So once again, it was your department that procured these sleeping bags that don't work. And it does relate to what this committee is here about, and it's about Arctic sovereignty and about our north.
Point of order for Mr. Hanley.
With respect and in follow-up to my colleague, Mr. Carr, I'm failing to see the relevance of this question to the subject at hand, barriers to economic development in Indigenous communities.
Thank you, Mr. Hanley, and again, I also don't see the relevance of this to the study at hand. We do have some very significant issues we need to be, I would suggest we should be spending this time on barriers to Indigenous economic development and the procurement. I know there's been many very relevant questions that have been asked today, and I'll just remind members to be sure to stick to the topic at hand so that we can get those answers. Mr. Zimmer.
Yes, and I represent as Shadow Minister for Northern Affairs and Arctic Sovereignty, Northerners and Inuit across the three territories. And one thing that's very much a concern to people in the north is Arctic sovereignty and security. And equipment like this, it's procured and needed for our Arctic sovereignty, for their Arctic sovereignty, protection of that Arctic sovereignty is necessary. And this, I know this government doesn't want to talk about
Mr. Chair, that's debate.
I know this government
debate,
is speaking to the point of order.
Mr. Chair, it's debate.
Well, that's fine. Then let's get back after it then. Is that fine?
So long as it's relevant, Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer, I'm going to hand the floor back to you. You have about a little bit more than 2.5 minutes at this point, so please do your best to stick to the topic at hand here. We did do a very robust study on the north, and we did have the committee did actually visit a number of communities in the north where we studied these topics. I think that would have been a very appropriate time to bring up those topics, but I don't see the relevance to the matter at hand today. But I do want to give the opportunity in the 2.5 minutes that you have at this point to return to that.
So thank you. We'll get back to it once again. And you're the procurement minister, are you not? Yes or no?
That's an easy question to answer. Yes, I'm there to help you.
So let's get back to it. So there's a project called the Polar Icebreaker Project, and there was a 2024 update by the Parliamentary Budget Officer. How much is the Polar Icebreaker Project projected to cost now, Minister?
I'll answer this question, although I know that some others might want to ask why we're not investing our time and energy on supporting Indigenous businesses' access to federal procurement, which is so important for economic and social development of those workers, of those businesses, and those communities. This is a rare instance, and I think a very precious one, in which we can all gather our.
Yeah, it's a real simple question. He said he had it. It sounded like he had read the report. The simple answer is how much is the project costing to date? And
it's not a point of order, but on the same point of order, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Carr, on the same non-point of order.
Well, if it's going to be recognized, sure. Mr. Chair, again, Mr. Zimmer is not talking about anything that is relevant to the debate at hand. It was Conservative members, along with the NDP and the Bloc, that sent us back here to talk about Indigenous economic development and barriers to it. He has not used the word Indigenous in the last 4 minutes in anything related to the question that he has posed to the minister. So, Chair, it is your prerogative to remove the floor from a member who is not staying, yes it is, who is not staying relevant to a debate. My colleague may be mistaken, but that is in fact the case. I would ask now for the 5th time, Mr. Chair, if he wants Minister Blair in that seat to answer questions about military procurement, then he can go to the Defence Committee and do so. It's insulting that we have been asked to talk about Indigenous issues, and he hasn't used the word Indigenous to ask a question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carr. And again, I do want to remind members to stick to the matter at hand. There is a certain amount of chair's prerogative on these things, and I want to give Mr. Zimmer another chance to ask one of those very, very relevant questions. And I know we have many questions that we want to get answered to that are maybe outside the scope of this study. But again, we're here to do, in addition to the barriers to the economic development in Indigenous communities, as has been ordered by the House. And so, Mr. Zimmer, I will give you the floor once more. But if it's not going to be relevant to the study at hand, then we are going to be moving on to another member.
A point of order, Mr. Chair. What I'm speaking about, how it affects northern communities and Arctic sovereignty, that does involve Indigenous communities directly. And if the member doesn't understand that, then maybe he should visit some northern communities so he can further understand how concerned they are about the lack of activity this Liberal government's doing on Arctic sovereignty and security. So maybe he wants to go talk to some northern communities and ask them about these questions. Can I get back to my question?
Point of order,
Chair?
Mr. Chair.
You will have the floor here for another 2 minutes or less. But again, there are many ways to frame this question that would make it relevant for this study, and I would just invite you to do that. But I will turn the floor back to you. But first, I see that Mr. Hanley has a point of order.
Yes, I do. I would suggest that my friend Mr. Zimmer is engaging in debate rather than addressing a point of order, which is really about Indigenous procurement. Again, the topic is Indigenous procurement, not Indigenous as some kind of broad anything goes topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Zimmer, I'll hand the floor back to you.
Thank you. And what we're here today is really talking about how this NDP Liberal government and its scandal around procurement, and specifically around Indigenous procurement. And I'm asking you a question about how much the icebreakers are costing, and it's all very relevant because it involves the North. So please, what are the polar icebreaker project that was supposed to cost $720 million announced by a previous Conservative government? What's the cost balloon to date, Minister?
Well, 2 pieces of good news here. The first one is that you're a member of Parliament of a riding where I think there are 13 First Nations communities. So it's good that we have this opportunity here to speak about Indigenous business procurement.
So the actual cost of the acquisition of those 2 polar icebreakers has ballooned to an estimated $8.5 billion. And I think what's concerning to Northerners...
Point of order.
Point of order,
Ms.
Gainey.
Just getting there. If you would have waited 2 seconds. Yep.
The relevance here is
Still
just
talking
way
about
off.
northern issues, Indigenous.
We are not talking about northern issues. We're talking about the motion that was put before the House, which is why we're here.
Thank you, Ms. Gainey. Again, I'm not seeing how this is relevant at all to the study at hand. If it would be useful, I'd be happy to circulate the motion again. The study at hand is, again, about Indigenous economic procurement and barriers to Indigenous economic development that we're dealing with today. So, again, Mr. Zimmer, we've been through this now through many points of orders. I don't want to keep...
One last comment, then we'll move on.
I will give you the floor for one last comment, and then we're going to move on to the next questioner.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. And I know the NDP Liberals, whether it's you, Minister, or the panel across the way, doesn't want to answer these questions that really matter to Northerners and to our Arctic sovereignty. I understand that. You're wrapped up deep in scandal. You want to change the channel. I understand it's unfortunate. As Minister, you're refusing to answer my questions today at committee. Thank you.
A great question we should be answering too, MP Zimmer, is how we would be supportive of your 13 First Nations communities in accessing federal procurement activities like the McLeod Lake First Nation, the Dog River First Nation, the Blueberry Rivers First Nations, and many others which are all located in your riding. So it would be great if we could spend time together within this particular setting to support the Indigenous businesses in your First Nations communities.
Chair, Indigenous leaders have said that Indigenous identity fraud is rampant in this program, but no one has been held accountable. And I want to come back to that. Nobody has been held accountable by the government for Indigenous identity fraud. And let's zero in on one famous example, MP Randy Boissonnault. Now, his company, Global Health Imports, misrepresented their Indigenous identity. We know that now. There's no debate. They made a claim to be Indigenous. That claim was false. First question, has the Indigenous identity fraud of Randy Boissonnault's company been referred to the RCMP?
So I believe I answered this question at my last committee appearance just a few weeks ago. The company in question, GHI, was never on the Indigenous business procurement list, and I believe Minister Duclos has additional information about.
Yeah, just before you chime in, Mr. Duclos, my question is very specific. We know they engage in Indigenous identity fraud in order to increase their chance of getting business from the government. That's fraud. Has this case been referred to the RCMP?
Monsieur le député Genuis, je pense qu'avant.
Mr. MP Genuis, I think when we describe things, we have to be careful of the language that we use. You've said it's a fraud. You would need to prove this, and I can assure you that if there had been fraud, there is in the government, in an independent way, mechanisms to ensure that these cases of fraud be dealt with in the proper manner.
Referring to the RCMP, but I am a bit struck, Mr. Duclos, that you think I should be careful saying that they committed fraud. They claim to be an Indigenous-owned business. They are not an Indigenous-owned business, but in the process of pursuing a contract with the Government of Canada, they falsely claim to be Indigenous. How is there any doubt about whether or not that is fraudulent?
Ce n'est pas aux politiciens comme nous sommes de déterminer.
It's not up to politicians that we are to determine whether there's any fraud.
En cours de justice artificielle, je pense qu'on doit faire confiance aux experts.
I think we have to trust the experts. Mr. Carr, it's really difficult to hear the minister.
Like he wasn't answering the question, I jumped in.
Monsieur le Président, je pense que
this farce is not allowed to go on at any other committee, Mr. Chair. So can you tell them to be quiet and let people actually do their work?
Mr. Genuis, the witness, the minister, was in the middle of answering the question that you asked, and then before he could actually get to the answer, you interrupted him. I understand that there are times where you want to ask a pointed question, and that is very much the practice and procedure of committees, but it's very important that we don't have the crosstalk because of the interpretation and also because of members that might have challenges hearing. So I just want to remind members not to be cross-talking because of the health impacts, which we've been warned about many times on committees and in the House. But with that, Mr. Genuis, you have a little,
yes,
2 minutes and 45 seconds.
So I'll just give the minister one more chance to answer the question. You have a company that I think quite clearly engaged in Indigenous identity fraud. You might say, well, maybe it wasn't quite fraud. Maybe they just lied in order to try to steal money from the taxpayers, but it wasn't really fraud. Have you referred information about this case to the RCMP?
Je dirais qu'il y a le droit et la responsabilité. Vous avez...
You have the right to your opinions, and you have we have the responsibility of validating whether there is fraud, and that responsibility has been put into operation in an independently, a politically independent way.
Were you responsible for terminating the government's contract with Round Point Consulting?
Pardon me. The contract with Round Point Consulting was terminated by the contracting authorities of Indigenous Services Canada, as the contracting authorities would in any situation.
Who made that decision?
It was any decision to terminate would be between the program authority, which is who I am,
Okay.
and the contracting authority.
So you made the decision?
Sorry?
So you made the decision?
So it's a joint decision between myself and contracting authorities.
Why was that decision made?
The decision was made because the work that was being done under that contract had changed significantly from when it was put in place, and the statement of work that had been used to award that contract no longer reflected accurately what the contractors were doing, and the work essentially had diminished and was not required.
Okay, they were in the middle of doing an audit into Canadian Healthcare Agency, and according to reports in the Globe and Mail, the government, so you told them to no longer look into indigeneity claims of companies. Is that true?
No, what you just stated is not factual.
Is the Globe and Mail story correct?
The audit was done in 2016. The termination of the contract occurred in 2023, and the changes to the process, including who was verifying indigeneity, occurred in 2022.
Is there anything in the Globe and Mail story on this that you dispute?
Yes.
It's to you.
I think that sometimes people, their opinions reflected in that article reflect the opinions of Mr. Gary Hardle.
Is there anything in the article that you dispute?
I think, Mr. Chair,
no, my questions are for Ms.
I am the minister,
Sultan.
and I get to direct how the questions are
No, you
answered
don't.
and asked.
No,
Actually,
you don't.
I do.
Actually, you don't.
I do.
Stop.
So, Mr. Genuous, your time is ready.
Mr. Chair, it's obvious what you're trying to do. That the official responsible for this didn't want to answer the question, so the minister jumped in to prevent her from needing to answer it. It's obvious to everyone what's going on.
That is not accurate, Mr. Chair. And the member of Parliament is, I would say, has asked the question, has received an answer. And what I would also say is that he asked this question of me earlier, and I have given him a clear answer.
Mr. Chair, who has the floor?
Because, Mr. Chair, that it's unfortunate that civil servants are being treated this way.
I asked a question of an official about very serious allegations, and I didn't get an answer.
So, Mr. Genuous, your time has elapsed here. Yeah. There will likely be another opportunity to ask a question.
Well, that is very revealing, Chair, and everybody saw what happened, that the official refused to answer the question, and the minister jumped in to try to save her.
We're moving on.
Actually, that's not accurate, Mr. Chair, and the official would like to speak
what happened.
at this point. Mr. Chair, this is not respectful of officials that are working on behalf of Canadians.
And you can let them answer the question.
We're moving on to our next question.
Mr. Chair, the official would like to answer the question.
All right, I'll give the official the opportunity to answer this, but we're over time here, and then we're moving on.
Order.
But first, we have a point of order from Mr. McLeod.
Mr. Chair, you're allowing people to speak over each other. I have a hearing issue. Today I brought my device for captions, and I'm still struggling to follow because there's too many voices coming on. If we could just restrict it to whoever's on the microphone, it'd be greatly appreciated.
Thank you for reminding members, Mr. McLeod. Of course, we need to limit the crosstalk here, both for interpretation and people that have hearing challenges. And I see on the same point of order we have Monsieur Lemire.
Thank you, Chair. I also want to repeat that for Francophones who are listening to the debate, the interpretation is fundamentally important, and to speak over witnesses decreases the understanding we can have of the debate. I thank the interpreters for their patience and their dedication, and several times they've said that it's very difficult to interpret. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to our witnesses. Minister Inasangare, is it appropriate Randy Boissonnault remain in the Liberal caucus?
Thank you, Mr. Schmale. As you know, each caucus is the master of its own domain, and I will leave that up to the Liberal caucus to decide.
Do you think it's appropriate he remain in there?
I believe he has taken the right steps to reflect on what's happened, and he is trying to defend his name. So I do believe that he is doing the right thing at the moment.
Okay, Minister Petitpas-Taylor, same question.
Thank you so much for that question, and always good to see you, MP Schmale. To elaborate a bit on what my friend and colleague has indicated, I believe that Randy Boissonnault contributes tremendously to our caucus. He contributes tremendously to what is happening in Western Canada. And again, he has appeared at committee last week and answered a number of questions. Okay. And again, I've appreciated serving with him as a member of Parliament in the class of 2015 and also in Cabinet in 2021.
Committing Indigenous identity fraud is wrong. Sure. Yeah, I'll start with you and then go back to Minister Sangre.
Intentionally misleading Canadians is wrong.
Same question?
Yes.
Do you think it's harmful as well?
Yes.
Okay. Same question, Mr. Minister. Okay, for the record, that was a nod. What do you think? I don't know who to start with now. Minister Sangre. Do you think the impact of Randy Boissonnault's actions has caused hurt and harm within Indigenous communities?
I think that it's fair to say that there have been a number of Indigenous leaders who have spoken out. And for his part, Mr. Boissonnault has taken responsibility and has apologized. I think the issue of Indigenous identity, and in particularly his case, he is an adoptee, from what I understand, is quite complex. And I believe he's taken the right steps. This is certainly not something that I think anyone should take lightly. He is taking the right measures to ensure that he both ensures healing for those who he may have impacted in a negative way, but at the same time ensures that he is able to clear his name and rebuild the trust that is required in the work that we do.
I was about the same thing as my friend. I believe that Minister Boissonnault, or rather Member Boissonnault, did the right thing, that he appeared before the committee last week. He spent 2 hours asking detailed questions put to him by the committee. Now he's taking the time to reset the clock to once again be able to rectify the situation.
So if we have, and we did have, an Indigenous woman inside the Liberal caucus, Jody Wilson-Raybould, she was kicked out of caucus for telling the truth. Now we have a non-Indigenous man who misled on a number of issues, being part of a co-owning a company while still being in caucus, and the list goes on. You heard the testimony, you referenced it. So we have an Indigenous woman that was kicked out for telling the truth. We have one that is misleading and has a cloudy past. How come he still remains in caucus and Jody Wilson-Raybould was shown the exit?
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
So we have a point of order, Mr. Carr.
Relevance?
Well, on the same point of order, let the record show that Member Carr couldn't even keep a straight face while he was saying that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carr. As always, I just want to remind members to keep comments relevant to the study at hand. And so I pause it for Mr. Schmale. You have 2 minutes and 9 seconds left.
Well, I trust how you keep time, Chair. So thank you very much. To the question, to the ministers.
I just want to repeat what I said earlier. Mr. Boissonnault has acknowledged the errors that took place. He's talked about his personal identity, the complexity that...
I think there should be an extra step here. Why is he still in caucus? If Jody Wilson-Raybould was shown the exit.
No, Mr. Chair, I have a legitimate point of order here. This is no, just
jaw-dropping breaking news. A legitimate point of order.
Colleagues, we have a point of order, Mr. Carr.
I had to specify it was legitimate in order to ensure that my colleagues across the way were aware. We are still on the same motion we were on last time. Could Mr. Schmale or you perhaps provide some direction on how whether or not a member belongs to a particular political party's caucus is relevant to Indigenous procurement? It's completely legitimate and fair for the member to ask questions about Mr. Boissonnault as it pertains to Indigenous procurement. No one's interrupting him when he chooses to do that. However, asking the ministers to comment on the membership of their political party's caucus and how that pertains to a member is not in any way that I can see relevant to the motion that we've been sent here to discuss. Perhaps you can speak to that, or Mr. Schmale can provide some further explanation.
So I'll just say one thing. So we are doing a study or an update to the barriers to Indigenous economic development. The order that we were given to the committee was that recommitted for the committee for further consideration with a view of studying the economic and anti-reconciliatory barriers posed by fraudulent bids and applications for procurement opportunities set aside for Indigenous businesses, including those from non-Indigenous owned companies. So just want to remind members of that and as much as possible to keep your questions and comments relevant to the study that's at hand. But with that, Mr. Schmale, you have a little bit more than a minute and a half to go.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to that question in a second here. Minister Petitpas-Taylor, this is not the first time you've took over a ministry from Randy Boissonnault. Do you feel uncomfortable doing so this time under the current circumstances?
I don't understand the premise of your question.
Well, that goes to my previous question about Jody Wilson-Raybould being removed from Caucus, but Randy Boissonnault still remaining in Caucus. I think this raises some pretty significant concerns. The fact that, again, he co-owned a company, was still bidding on contract. They checked a box claiming Indigenous ownership, trying to access Indigenous contracts set aside specifically for Indigenous-owned business. We just have 1,100 companies that were removed from the registry. So now you're coming into a role, not the first time you've taken over for a ministry for Minister Boissonnault. Under these circumstances, this cloud that surrounds Minister Boissonnault, it can't be overly comfortable walking into that office now.
Well, first and foremost, I think that's the question that you'd have to ask MP Boissonnault with respect to his dealings. I'm feeling comfortable getting briefed up on a new file that I've just taken over in the past 2 weeks. And again, my officials have been very helpful in helping me get up to date on the files.
My previous question about Jody Wilson-Raybould. She was removed, Randy Boissonnault stays. How do we...
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Point of order, Mr. Carr.
Can you provide some direction to the committee, please, on the relevance and the connection between a former member of Parliament, their membership within the Liberal caucus, and the motion that we were sent here to discuss as it pertains to Indigenous procurement?
The barriers to economic barriers to economic development in Indigenous communities. I'm speaking to this because Randy Boissonnault co-owned a company that claimed Indigenous status when in fact they were not. That, to me, is a barrier to economic development. So let's talk about it.
Not the membership in caucus.
So let's talk about it.
So,
Stay on track.
Very quickly, final question, and your time is just about up.
Okay, that was my question. Why?
That's a question that you'd have to refer to MP Boissonnault, and I think he was here last week for 2 hours to answer many of your questions.
Mr. Schmale, we're moving on to
Minister Anandasangri, it's good to see you here. You made a couple statements about Indigenous identity in your opening. You said that indigeneity is personal and complex. You also said that Indigenous identity is defined by the communities themselves. I would just observe that these statements are somewhat contradictory. Either indigeneity is personal, that is, it's up to the individual to define whether or not they're Indigenous, or it is defined by the community. And if it's defined by the community, then an individual ought not just say, I'm Indigenous on their own. But if it's personal and complex, then that opens up more space for self-identification on varying grounds. So I wonder if you can reconcile that contradiction and tell us, do you think Indigenous identity is more defined by the individual who decides how they want to identify, or if it's more defined by the community that says, yes or no, this person is Indigenous?
Thank you, Mr. Genius, and good to see you again, and good to be in a committee room with you. Look, I don't think they're mutually incompatible. In a sense of collective identity, when we talk about collectivities, I do believe communities should be defining what that collectivity looks like and is, and the historical formation of that collectivity over generations and in some cases millennia. The distinction sometimes does come to the individual. So, for example, if you speak to Mohawks in Ontario, they will fiercely say the issues around identity is strictly up to the individual nation to define what citizenship looks like. It is not up to the federal government in this case to be. So they're saying that. Right? If I may just finish, because I think you asked a very critical question.
Just briefly, though, please.
And I do want to give you a wholesome answer, okay? So I do think in that case it is that collectivity that defines who their citizens are. That's the way it should be.
Okay.
With respect to the individual, in a situation, if you look at the history of issues around residential schools, on child welfare systems, where someone's identity has, for many reasons, for a myriad of reasons, been compounded by the fact that they may not be living with their biological parents or living in a community where they would have been born and they have long lineage, or they can trace long lineage. I do think it's legitimate for an individual to be contemplating and to understand what that identity looks like.
Okay, I have limited time, so I think I understand where you're going with this, but in those cases, you've got an individual that's seeking information about their own history, their heritage that they've been separated from. It's still the community that defines that identity. It's just that an individual has been separated from that community. This question is at the heart of a lot of this issue, because you have now a lot of people popping up trying to take advantage of government programs who don't have connections to any kind of community. And I was struck by your comment that the Randy Boissonnault case is complex. I don't think it's complex at all. I think it's very simple. What do you think is complex on these identity issues about Randy Boissonnault's previous claims around Indigenous identity? What's complex there?
Well, to me, first and foremost, one of the things that I've contemplated on this issue is that he was adopted. So he was not from his biological family unit. Can
I just say on that, just quickly, though, he claimed to be a non-status adopted Cree, and Ms. Idlout asked him what Cree nation, and he couldn't answer that question. His family's not Cree. His family is Métis, and the rules around membership in the Métis community are very clear, and they don't apply to him. So it's not actually complex. I mean, he has. I just don't. Why do you think it's complex?
Sorry, Mr. Genuous, there's a point of order. Mr. Batiste?
I think that Mr. Genuous's comment there that says the Métis is very clear is an inaccurate assessment.
That's obviously not a point of order. Use your own round if you think what I say is inaccurate. Come on. You know the rules.
If he says it's simple, it's offensive to Indigenous people around Canada that he would think this is that indigeneity is a complex thing. In his very question, he talks about.
Can we just get past the feigned outrage? The Métis Nation of Alberta has a clear sense of who they are.
There's too much
on the same point of
crosstalk happening here. So, Mr. Batiste, this is not a point of order. I do want to give the floor back to Mr. Genuous. You have about 45 seconds.
I would just ask him to be respectful of his language towards Indigenous people.
Yeah.
And their criteria for defining themselves.
Okay, can I just speak on the same point of order, Mr. Chair? The Métis Nation of Alberta know who they are, and they have been clear about who they are, and they have been clear that we get to decide, and that Randy Boissonnault is not Indigenous.
So, look, there's a lot of.
We're going to hear from them very soon. It doesn't Randy Boissonnault.
So do you know?
It's not complex. It doesn't apply to
Mr. Batiste. Mr. Batiste, right now, Mr. Genuous has the floor. He has about 45 seconds left. There will be.
Be respectful.
I agree. All members need to be respectful. I know this is a very, very charged subject, and there will be another round for questions from the Liberal Party and comments, but I do want to give the floor back to Mr. Genuous for about 40 seconds.
Yeah, just to really drill down on this, Mr. Anasagri, and then I'll give you the floor to wrap up. But Mr. Boissonnault said he was non-status adopted Cree. He claimed to come up with that term in conversation with an Indigenous researcher. The Indigenous researcher said no, he didn't give him that term. And you and Mr. Baptiste and others want to say that this is complex. He's a member of your caucus, and he just lied about who he was for political advantage. I don't think it's complex at all. Why? Do you maintain that it's complex, and if so, why is it complex?
Mr. Genuous, there's a point of order. Mr. Hanley.
Again, please respect for the member, and the accusation of lying, I think, is inappropriate.
It's not against the rules to tell the truth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hanley.
Let's answer the question.
I do want to remind all members to be respectful. I know Standing Order 18 speaks specifically to that. With that, time is very short. If Mr. Genuous could get to his question, and then we'll moving on to the next speaker.
Yeah, I mean, I've tried to ask it a few times. Love to hear from Minister Anasagri again. Why is it complex? It's not complex, it's simple. But why do you think it's complex? In the case of Mr. Boissonnault specifically.
Mr. Genuous, I believe I've answered that question. We can agree to disagree on this. It is not that straightforward for someone who was adopted into a family. The issue of identity is complex to start off with, but in this particular case, I think it's compounded by the fact that he was adopted. I think he's spoken for himself. I'm not here to add to that. I think he's given you his position. As far as I'm concerned, if you disagree with my analysis of this, we can agree to disagree.
Thank you very much, Mr. Genuous. We're moving on. Ms. Idlout, moving next to Mr. Schmale for 5 minutes.
Thank you again to our witnesses. I want to pick up on somewhat where we left off when we talked about earlier that Indigenous claiming Indigenous identity and it being fraudulent is wrong and harmful. I think we all agreed on that. So how does the government recover from the damage done within Indigenous communities after that?
Mr. Schmale, I think the work, first of all, let me just speak about what Randy needs to do and what he's committed to doing. From what my understanding is that he is acknowledged and apologized for the errors. And he is also committed to meeting with Indigenous people and leaders in order to ensure that he's able to rebuild trust. I think it's a personal responsibility he's taken. From a government perspective, I want to just talk about, I think there are a number of issues that have come up, both, I think from a process perspective, but ultimately about how the government put in a directory that is not self-determined by Indigenous people, and I believe that is the starting point for this conversation. And then I think we need to do greater work around the review, how what's constituted, what the partnership looks like, because it is ultimately Indigenous people that need to determine who are Indigenous businesses and who should be qualifying for procurement. So I believe that is the path that we need to take, and it can't happen overnight. But in the meantime, we need to have some significant safeguards to ensure that Indigenous identity concerns are addressed immediately while we develop a longer-term system.
So, given the fact that 1,100 fake Indigenous businesses were removed from the registry, we have the Shannon Matabawaban from the NACA organization, the executive director, saying upwards of 70% of the listed businesses on that directory are not Indigenous owned. What other concrete steps has been taken to ensure this registry actually is true?
I believe Minister Haidu has answered those questions. It is very much in her purview, but I will just just add that the actual thinking around Indigenous procurement and ensuring that there's 5% Indigenous procurement, I think it's absolutely necessary. I think how we get there is where I think we need to do better, and in ensuring especially that those who are eligible for contracts are in fact do qualify under the current procurement mandates that exist. If we need to tighten those mandates, if we need to improve, if that 51% need to come to 60 or 65%, maybe that's a conversation that we need to have, but we need to have it in conjunction with Indigenous people. And I believe the government is very committed. We're very committed to moving forward to ensure that we do far better on this issue, with the absolute determination that we need to increase procurement towards Indigenous businesses.
Yeah, the registry still is not solid. We have one Indigenous organization after another saying it isn't solid. And given the fact that your portfolio, to large extent, is in the name, right? Crown Indigenous Relations. You're the one sent in to, aside from negotiating and other things, but to make sure that relationship remains solid and strong. It's got to make you uncomfortable that Randy Boissonnault is still in Caucus. You're the one managing the relationships.
Point of order, Mr.
We have a point of order, Mr. Carr.
Just coming back to this piece of relevance around Caucus, I don't believe I saw that anywhere in the House instruction on the motion, but if we are going to go there, perhaps we can talk about why Karen Vecchio's not the chair of Status of Women anymore. Arnold Viersen was removed from this particular committee.
Now we're going on. This is a bit...
Mr. O'Toole was removed from their caucus. Maybe we can start to talk about why that is.
Mr. Carr, I think you've made your point about the relevance here, and are getting off of the relevance as well. The same point, I do again want to remind members the study at hand on barriers to Indigenous economic development, and the order which is on the procurement side and the anti-reconciliatory impacts of non-Indigenous businesses as well. But with that, I will hand the floor back over to Mr. Smale for about 45 seconds.
Chair, just a point of order quickly before we reach on the same point of order, because this keeps coming up and it might be uncomfortable for Mr. Carr's Liberal caucus. We're talking about a case of Indigenous identity fraud. We're talking to the minister who's responsible for the government's efforts on reconciliation, and it obviously impacts those reconciliation efforts when you have a member of the Liberal caucus who engaged in Indigenous identity fraud, and his company falsely represented themselves as Indigenous in order to try to get government contracts, and he remains in the Liberal caucus. That's very different from questions about
debate, Mr.
committee assignments, etc. I mean, I'm happy not to talk about it if you didn't bring it up, Mr. Carr, and I know this is an uncomfortable subject for you, and you probably have feelings about Mr. Boissonnault's Indigenous identity fraud as well. But,
we're getting into a debate here, and let's get back to the matter at hand. Mr. Schmale, the floor is yours. We have about 45 seconds.
Okay, I pose the question to the minister. It says, as the minister responsible for Crown Indigenous Relations, are you comfortable with Randy Boissonnault still being in caucus?
Well, I believe Mr. Boissonnault is taking the right steps in order to I think, work with people that he knows and to gain the trust of Indigenous people. I will leave it to him to clear his name. I think he has been at committee before, and he has answered the questions and concerns posed to him.
Do you have trust in the Indigenous procurement program, the way it's set up now?
I believe it needs to be better.
Thank you very much.